Today we're hitching a ride on a covered wagon, straight into the heart of the American frontier. Sure, you might remember the Oregon Trail game or those classic westerns with sun-drenched plains and noble pioneers, but behind the romance lies a grittier truth. Life on the trail was no joyride. It was raw, relentless, and often heartbreaking. So before we let nostalgia take the reins, let's uncover 13 brutal realities of life on the trail. What did it truly cost to chase the American dream out west? Let's find out together. Months of misery. The first harsh truth, and perhaps the foundation for all other difficulties, was the terrifyingly long travel time. Traveling by covered wagon was not fast at all. Even on the best days with flat terrain and favorable weather, a covered wagon might go about 20 miles. That was the ideal scenario, folks. More often, they only traveled between 8 and 20 miles per day. Rough terrain, treacherous mountain passes, or bad weather all could slow down the wagon train, sometimes to a crawl. Try to imagine, starting from St. Louis, a common departure point for trips west. The straight-line distance to San Francisco is about 1,750 miles. Even at the optimal 20 miles a day, theoretically it would take nearly 90 days to cover that distance. But that was just theory. In reality, wagon trains rarely maintained that speed. There were constant delays, broken wheels, livestock got sick or exhausted, the weather turned bad, the terrain was too difficult. And more importantly, the actual trails were much longer than the crow flies. They wound around obstacles through valleys and over mountains, adding hundreds, even thousands of miles. The result? A trip from St. Louis to the West Coast often took about 6 months. 6 months of grueling journey, enduring all the harshness of the weather, with extremely limited food and comforts. It was a terrible test of endurance. People got sick, got injured, and sometimes even died along the way. Reaching the West Coast was an extraordinary achievement, a testament to the incredible resilience and determination of the pioneers. They paid a very high price in time and hardship just to have a chance to start a new life. 6 months living in a state of near existence, not life. Really hard to imagine, isn't it? Your home was a bone-jarring box. Now let's talk about their actual mode of transportation, the covered wagon. We see them romantically in movies, but what about reality? The most iconic type was the prairie schooner. With its curved wooden bows creating a rounded roof and covered with canvas, from a distance it looked like a ship's sail gliding on the sea of the prairie. This wagon was like the 19th century minivan, used to carry the whole family and their possessions. There was another type, the Conestoga wagon, larger and heavier, often pulled by larger teams of animals. But its size and weight made it unsuitable for long cross-country treks. The Conestoga was better suited for shorter trips, hauling freight between cities or to nearby territories. Regardless of the type, travel in these wagons was incredibly challenging. Forget smooth paved roads. Pioneers followed rough trails, often just deeply rutted paths. Bad weather could turn them into muddy quagmires. And here's the kicker. These wagons had absolutely no suspension system. The wheels and axles were made of rigid wood without any cushioning whatsoever. Every little rock, every deep rut on the trail created jarring bounces transmitted straight to the wagon bed. Passengers were tossed around constantly. Hour after hour, day after day. Just constant bouncing. It felt like you were sitting in a wooden box and being violently shaken by someone with no end in sight. Surprisingly, the prairie schooner was even considered smoother than the Conestoga wagon. While larger and carried more, its size made it more prone to tipping. Many trails weren't wide enough for the Conestoga, and its wheels would often slide off the trail, leading to a bone-jarring experience. To escape the constant bouncing, many pioneers chose to walk beside their covered wagons. But imagine folks walking hundreds, even thousands of miles over that rough terrain. It was incredibly exhausting and left them completely exposed to the elements. So it was a brutal choice. Endure the brutal bumpy ride or the exhausting walk? Neither was easy, and that says a lot about the hardships pioneers faced on the journey west. Sitting was miserable, walking was miserable. There were no comfortable options. No room at the inn or the wagon. With a canvas cover, it's easy to picture pioneer families gathering cozy inside the covered wagon at night, right? It seems like a natural shelter after a long day, but the reality was quite different. Those prairie schooners were filled with all the family's possessions. Every inch of space was utilized to the maximum, and the space inside wasn't large to begin with. only about 4 feet wide and 10 feet long. Imagine a queen-size bed, and then picture packing all your worldly goods into it. There simply wasn't enough room for people to sleep inside. So, most nights, families slept outside. They might lay blankets on the ground or set up a makeshift tent using canvas and poles. This offered only minimal protection from the elements. They were fully exposed to the blazing sun by day, freezing temperatures by night, sudden rain showers, and wind. And if the weather turned truly nasty, they'd have to shelter under the wagon, trying to find any refuge they could, even if it meant sleeping on hard dirt. This made for uncomfortable and often restless nights. Definitely not a recipe for good sleep. And yes, it probably did a number on their backs after months of sleeping on the ground. Waking up sore was likely unavoidable. Feeling damp, cold, or hot lingered all night. Trail cuisine and an unexpected fuel source. Okay, you're on the trail heading west in your covered wagon. You've packed your goods, tools, everything needed for a new life. But what about food? You couldn't exactly stop at a grocery store on the Oregon Trail, could you? As we just mentioned, prairie schooners were filled with household goods not ready to eat meals. So how did they survive and keep their families fed on their 6-month journey? That's where the chuck wagon came in. This was the mobile kitchen of the wagon train, similar in size to a prairie schooner, but specifically outfitted for preparing and storing food. It played an essential role in feeding the families on their long trek. The chuck wagon had a water barrel attached to the side, providing easy access to fresh water throughout the day. Many had coffee grinders, offering a much-needed caffeine boost after a tiring day of travel. Underneath the chuck wagon was the possum belly, a storage compartment for firewood and, interestingly, dried cow dung, also known as cow chips. Yes, you heard that right. On the vast treeless prairies, dried cow dung became a valuable source of fuel for cooking fires. It burned slowly and provided enough heat for simple meals. This shows the incredible resourcefulness and adaptability of the pioneers. Each evening, the chuck wagon became the heart of the camp. Families gathered as cooks prepared simple meals like beans, bacon, and biscuits. It was a time to share stories, build community, a welcome moment of rest after a long day on the trail. The chuck wagon wasn't just a place to cook. It was a symbol of ingenuity and community spirit, essential for the survival and morale of the entire train on their journey west. Sitting down, eating a hot meal, however simple, after a grueling day must have been incredibly precious. Mules and oxen, not horses. We often associate the Wild West with horses and skilled riders. True, many Native American tribes were master horsemen, using horses for hunting, warfare, and travel. The U.S. Army and explorers also relied heavily on horses. But one group was largely excluded from this horse culture: the settlers. For most pioneer families, owning a horse was simply too expensive. Horses were costly to acquire and required significant expense for feeding and care. Settlers were already stretched thin, buying their covered wagons, supplies, and food for the journey. A horse was a luxury they couldn't afford. Instead, they relied on mules and oxen. These sturdy animals were much more practical for the journey west. Unlike horses, mules and oxen could survive on a rough forage found along the trail, making feeding easier and cheaper. They were also stronger and more durable, capable of pulling heavy-laden wagons across vast distances and challenging terrain. Mules, known for their sure-footedness, were especially useful in mountain regions. Oxen, though slower, were incredibly strong and reliable, ideal for pulling heavy loads over long stretches. They became the primary work animals on the western trails. Upon arrival, settlers continued to rely on their mules and oxen for farming and other work. These animals became essential to building their new lives. Horses, perhaps flashier, simply weren't practical for the average pioneer family. Their dependence on mules and oxen showed the resourcefulness and practicality that were hallmarks of the westward expansion. These quiet work animals were truly the heroes pulling a new civilization west. The canvas cover was little protection. You'd think at least the canvas cover would protect folks and goods from the harsh weather, right? Reality. It's much more complex. Weather was a constant challenge for pioneers crossing the western trails. The prairie schooners with their canvas tops did offer some shelter, but not much. The reason was the canvas itself was not waterproof initially. Settlers had to treat it to make it resistant to the elements. They started with thick cotton canvas, often around 10 ounces. Then they would coat it with a layer of linseed oil. This created a water barrier, protecting the family's belongings from light rain and snow. Once treated, the canvas was carefully draped over the wagon frame and secured. But even treated canvas wasn't perfect. On the vast prairie, wind was a relentless factor. Rain rarely fell straight down. Strong winds could blow rain sideways right under the canvas cover. And when it wasn't raining, the wind often kicked up clouds of dust and sand, whipping at the wagon and getting into every crevice. The feeling of dust and sand getting in your eyes, nose, mouth, clinging to clothes and possessions must have been incredibly uncomfortable. To combat this, settlers added a drawstring to the edges of the canvas. This allowed them to pull the cover tightly, creating a more enclosed space like a giant hood for their wagon. It helped keep out wind, blowing rain, and dust, providing a bit more protection against the harsh elements. But even with these precautions, severe weather was a constant threat. A sudden storm could render all efforts useless. Breakdown miles from anywhere. Picture this. You're traveling cross-country in a covered wagon, miles from any sign of civilization. Suddenly something breaks. No paved roads, no repair garages, no tow trucks. Just you, your broken wagon, and the vast wilderness. This was the reality for pioneers. Breakdowns were a frequent threat. The rough trails were absolutely brutal on the wooden wagons. Wooden wheels cracked and splintered on rocks and difficult terrain. Axles snapped under the weight and stress. Metal parts wore down and broke off, and when something broke, you were entirely on your own. So, pioneers packed their wagons with essential tools: hammers, saws, axes, nails, anything they might need to make repairs. They also carried spare parts because they knew that wagon breakdowns were inevitable. But sometimes, even the best preparation wasn't enough. They had to improvise using whatever materials they could find to make repairs. A sturdy tree branch, a piece of animal hide, or whatever could work temporarily. A broken wagon meant the entire train had to stop. Families had to unload everything from the wagon, a grueling task in harsh conditions. Often, they even had to tip the wagon on its side to access the underside for repairs. All of this while still facing the elements, wildlife, and other potential dangers. Each successful repair was a hard-won victory, a testament to their resilience and ingenuity. They were their own mechanics, relying on their skills and resourcefulness to overcome these constant challenges. The pressure to fix it yourself, because otherwise the whole train would slow down or leave you behind, must have been immense. Treacherous river crossings. Sooner or later, every pioneer family heading west had to face river crossings. While much of the West was arid, rivers and streams still cut across the landscape, posing a serious challenge. These crossings were difficult for everyone: the families, their livestock, and the wagons themselves. Sometimes on larger rivers there would be ferry services, but ferries were not cheap, and most settlers couldn't afford them. That meant they had to ford the river, drive the wagon train right through the water, a very risky proposition. On smaller rivers, pioneers often had to improvise, building rafts out of whatever materials they could find. If they were lucky, there were trees nearby. They could lash logs together to create a makeshift ferry. The crucial factor was finding the right spot to cross. They needed a narrow stretch of river with a quiet current. Finding this spot could take hours, even days, while the weather could change at any moment. Once a viable spot was found, they would try to waterproof the wagon bed, coating it with wax and sealing any cracks. The covered wagon now became a type of boat, a very fragile boat. Then, with the oxen straining to pull, they would slowly push the wagon into the current. A successful river crossing was a huge relief, but it was always a gamble. If the current was too strong or the wagon too heavy, it could easily tip over, spilling everything into the river. Livestock could be swept away. People could be injured or even drown. River crossings were tense, dangerous moments, a stark reminder of the perils of the journey west. The fear, the extreme tension of pushing the wagon into the water, not knowing what would happen, must have been a terrifying experience for everyone, from young children to old adults. The real killers: disease and accidents. So how dangerous was the Oregon Trail, really? It's hard to give precise numbers. Like the total number of emigrants, the number of deaths is difficult to pinpoint. Estimates vary quite a bit. Some historians put the mortality rate at around 4 to 6% of all travelers. That translates to about 12,000 to 24,000 deaths. Other estimates go up to 10%. What were the biggest dangers? It was accidents and disease. Pioneer diaries frequently mention gun accidents, injuries from encounters with wildlife, drowning, like during river crossings, and death from exposure to the cold. Wagon accidents were also common, and tragically, children were sometimes killed or severely injured after falling under moving wheels. Life on the trail was precarious. Death was a frequent companion. a stark reminder of the risks pioneers faced on the journey west. But the biggest killer, the most terrifying invisible enemy, was disease. Sanitation was a massive challenge. Opportunities to bathe or wash clothes were rare, and clean drinking water was often scarce. Human and animal waste, along with garbage and dead animal carcasses, often contaminated water sources along the trail. Cholera, a waterborne illness, was the biggest killer overall. Diphtheria, another dangerous infectious disease, was the leading cause of death in children. Exhaustion from the long journey and poor nutrition also made pioneers susceptible to other illnesses like typhoid, mountain fever, possibly tick-borne, dysentery, mosquito-borne diseases like malaria, food poisoning, scurvy, lack of vitamin C, and alkali poisoning from contaminated water. Measles, mumps, and smallpox also took a heavy toll, especially on children. Childbirth on the trail also posed serious risks for women. The lack of proper medical care meant that even minor illnesses could quickly become life-threatening. Disease was a constant fear, and its presence cast a long shadow over the journey west. It's hard to imagine the helplessness of watching a loved one fall ill with nothing you could do. The truth about Native American encounters. Now, let's talk about an aspect often heavily misunderstood in Western movies. We often see images of wagon trains circling up for defense against Native American attacks. But in reality, conflict with Native Americans was relatively rare during the peak years of the Oregon Trail. Historian John Unruh's research indicates that fewer than 400 emigrants were killed in Native American attacks between 1840 and 1860. Deaths from disease accidents versus deaths from Native American conflict. Compared to the tens of thousands who died from sickness and accidents, this number shows that Native American attacks, while terrifying when they happened, were not the primary danger. More often than not, interactions between pioneers and Native Americans were peaceful, even helpful. Native Americans often traded supplies with pioneers, operated ferry services, or assisted with managing livestock. While wagon trains did often circle up at night, the primary purpose of this was to corral their livestock, not for defense against attacks. In the rare instances attacks did occur, the wagon train was usually in marching formation, not circled for defense. The Hollywood image of constant conflict does not reflect the more complex and nuanced reality of life on the Oregon Trail. Sadly, many conflicts that did happen between pioneers and Native Americans were often provoked by the pioneers themselves. Cultural misunderstanding, arrogance, and violent actions towards Native Americans, such as random shootings, sometimes provoked retaliation. And often, this retaliation didn't target the specific group who caused the incident, but rather the next wagon train that came along. After the 1850s, attacks on smaller wagon trains or individual travelers did increase. This rise in violence reflected the growing hostility of Native Americans towards white settlers who were increasingly encroaching on their lands. The relationship between pioneers and Native Americans was complex and often tense, and the increasing pressure of westward expansion exacerbated these tensions. Understanding this gives us a fuller, fairer picture of this complicated history. Arrival was not always the end of hardship. After 6 long months facing countless dangers from terrain, weather, disease, and accidents, they finally saw their destination. The feeling of relief and happiness must have been immeasurable. But the final harsh truth on this list is, arrival wasn't always a happy ending. Many pioneers arrived in dire straits. Some had run out of food and were starving. Others were sick and exhausted after the long journey. Many were destitute, having lost their wagon, their possessions, or spent their last dollars on fees along the way. Imagine, after everything they went through, after surviving sickness, accidents, river crossings, fixing wagons in the wilderness, they reached the promised land, with nothing left, utterly depleted, starving, and sick. The dream of a new life seemed still very far away. Fortunately, earlier Oregon settlers often organized relief efforts. Generous settlers would form supply trains and meet the newcomers at the Dalles, a significant location at the end of the Oregon Trail, providing much-needed supplies and assistance for their final stretch. This help was often the difference between life and death for those who had endured so much to reach their destination. While the journey west was grueling, it also revealed the compassion and generosity of those who had been through the difficult journey themselves and were willing to share with those who came after. The moment of receiving help when utterly depleted must have been incredibly touching. Why they pushed on, motivation, and consequences. After hearing all those harsh truths, one big question remains. Why did they do it? What drove hundreds of thousands of people to take such terrible risks? and endure such unbelievable hardship. It's truly admirable how those pioneers persevered towards the West, despite the horrifying hardships they faced. The dream of a better life, the opportunity to own their own piece of land, that's what fueled their determination. Entire families, from grandparents to young children, embarked on these arduous journeys hoping for a new start. They were the driving force behind westward expansion, opening up a new era for the United States. However, this chapter of American history isn't just about the story of pioneer resilience and determination. This westward expansion also brought devastating consequences for Native Americans. As settlers claimed the land, Native American tribes were displaced and confined to reservations. Their way of life was changed forever, often in a tragic way. This is a part of the history that cannot be ignored when talking about the trail. This era was shaped by the concept of manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was destined to expand its territory across the continent. And so it happened, reaching all the way to the Pacific. The frontier was opened, leading to industrial development and technological advancements like the Transcontinental Railroad. By the late 1800s, cross-country travel had become significantly easier, but it was those early pioneers in their covered wagons who had opened the way. Their journey was incredibly difficult, full of hard labor and constant danger. Many did not survive. Their story is one of incredible resilience and determination, but also one of loss and displacement for another people. It's a complex and important part of American history. The trail's enduring legacy. The driving of the Golden Spike at Promontory, Utah in 1869, completing the first transcontinental railroad, signaled a major shift in westward migration. The era of the great overland trails was coming to a close. However, the Oregon Trail itself evolved over the decades. The California Gold Rush of 1849 brought a massive influx of 49ers, changing the trail and the communities around it. The 1850s saw an increased military presence along the route, along with physical improvements like ferries and bridges. Steamboats began operating on the Columbia River, offering an alternative to wagon travel for part of the journey. The 1860s brought even more changes. Settlements grew larger and more populated. Communication improved with the Pony Express and later the Transcontinental Telegraph. Stagecoach lines expanded, offering faster travel options. The Oregon Trail, once a remote and challenging path, was becoming increasingly integrated into a rapidly changing nation. The railroad might have marked the end of an era, but the Oregon Trail had undergone significant transformation before that. New communication and transportation technologies often followed the established routes of the Oregon Trail. Telegraph lines were strung along the trail, and railroad tracks were sometimes laid directly over its path. While the railroad didn't immediately eliminate wagon travel, it significantly reduced the need for it. Of all the Western trails, the Oregon Trail remained in use the longest, partly because the railroad didn't reach Oregon until the early 1880s. Even after railroads replaced most wagon traffic, the Oregon Trail continued to serve another purpose. It became a major route for driving cattle and sheep eastward to market. The trail, once the path of westward expansion, now facilitated a different kind of movement, connecting the growing West with established markets in the East. The Oregon Trail, while no longer the primary route for Western migration, continued to play a role in the developing American economy. The Oregon Trail, as a continuous traversable route as it once was, no longer exists. But its legacy remains. Traces of the trail are still visible today, offering glimpses into this important chapter of American history. In many places, you can still see deep ruts carved into the ground by thousands of covered wagons. Near Guernsey, Wyoming, these ruts are particularly striking, cut up to 5 feet deep into the sandstone. Imagine the countless wagons that passed over this very spot, carrying hopeful pioneers westward. Names and dates carved into soft sandstone blocks, like at Independence Rock, still bear witness to the passage of these travelers. These inscriptions, made over a century ago, offer a personal connection to the pioneers who made this arduous journey. Many landmarks along the trail are now protected areas. Scotts Bluff National Monument and Chimney Rock National Historic Site preserve iconic rock formations that guided and inspired generations of pioneers. Historic forts such as Forts Bridger, Kearney, Laramie, and Vancouver, along with sites like Whitman Mission, offer further insight into life on the trail. These preserved sites allow us to connect with the past, providing a tangible link to the pioneers who blazed the trail west, shaping the nation we know today. Recognizing the importance of the Oregon Trail, the U.S. Congress established the Oregon National Historic Trail in 1978. The goal is to preserve and protect the remnants of the trail and provide public access where possible. The National Park Service oversees the trail, coordinating with the Bureau of Land Management and other agencies. Several interpretive centers along the route offer visitors a deeper understanding of the trail's history and significance. The Oregon Trail also connects with other National Park Service sites, offering a broader perspective on westward expansion, exploring themes of settlement, natural history, and challenges. By preserving and interpreting these sites, we gain a deeper appreciation for the sacrifices and triumphs of those who traveled the Oregon Trail, shaping the American West and the nation. The Oregon Trail didn't just leave its mark on the landscape, it also became a part of popular culture. Several films have depicted the trail and its challenges. In 1977, there was even a TV miniseries called The Oregon Trail. But perhaps the most famous portrayal of the Oregon Trail is the educational video game. Wildly popular in the 1980s and 90s, the game introduced generations of students to the hardships and adventure of westward migration. And it's not just a relic of the past. The Oregon Trail game has been re-released in various digital formats, ensuring that new generations can experience this interactive journey into history. From film to television to video games, the Oregon Trail continues to capture our imagination, reminding us of the pioneers who bravely faced the unknown to forge a new life in the West. How do you feel after hearing these facts? What surprised you the most? Or if you ever played the Oregon Trail game, what from the game do you remember most, and how does it compare or contrast with the reality we just explored? Leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. If you found this story interesting and want to learn more about American history, about nostalgic stories that evoke memories, check out other videos on our channel. We always strive to bring you the most engaging and truthful content. Our channel has a lot of growth potential, and your support is the biggest motivation to keep creating meaningful content. If you haven't subscribed yet, please help the channel grow by hitting the subscribe button now. It's completely free and helps you not miss any new videos from us.